Section M, Shattering the Two-Term Tradition. So this, my friends, we're talking about the election of 1940. So for the Republicans, we kind of have a unique case because there were two front runners for the Republicans at first. We have ex-President Taft's son, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, and then also a lawyer from New York. His name is Thomas Dewey. So both of these Republicans are kind of forerunners for the Republican nomination. However, once Republicans meet in Philadelphia for their actual convention, we see kind of a surprise candidate come up. This guy was never even in politics before. His name was Wendell Willkie. And he was a lawyer from Indiana. Like I said, no political experience, but his appeal was really his personality. He was kind of Lincoln-esque in the fact that a very magnetic personality, like a magnet, you're attracted to the person, very trustful, very honest. And, you know, Republicans were looking for someone to possibly beat the champ, and they were convinced that if anyone was going to beat the Democrats, it was going to be Willkie. So kind of the surprise candidate comes forth from the Republicans, our friend Wendell Willkie. Okay, so now the big question is, will FDR run for a third term? Because before FDR, we see that two-term tradition has stuck, right? Well, FDR decides that yes, he will run, and his kind of justification is that he owed it to America to put forth his experience to help them through this crisis or this time of crisis. So he said personally he wanted to retire, but for the good of America, he will stick with it. So let me just get my notes here. So what really happens is Willkie goes on a whirlwind campaign, giving 500 speeches, and you know, for the most part, he calls FDR a dictator. He has too much power. He, you know, mostly says there's no indispensable man. You're putting him too far up on this pedestal. He's just like us. But what was really important is this, okay? So Willkie could have easily taken the position of saying FDR is taking too many steps forward or bringing us too close to war or being too interventionist, so to speak. He could have easily accused FDR of taking too many steps towards war, but he decides not to do that. And for the most part, Willkie really agrees with FDR, especially, you know, we need to bolster Britain, but we want to stay out of war. FDR during this campaign, he's kind of too busy really to campaign, but the thought was, you know, why change horses in midstream? You know, FDR has brought us through this Great Depression, and now he's kind of in the midst of what might be the United States during the war. So the idea was, why switch horses in midstream? So we see FDR indeed win the first president and only president to win a third term. Okay, it was kind of a landslide, right? It was 449 for FDR and then 82 for Willkie, but the idea is, you know, it's not the landslide that once was, you know, in the 32 election. Anyway, Section N, A Landmark Lendlease Law. Okay, so now we're switching policy. Okay, at first we're like absolutely no trade with belligerent nations, and then we had the cash and carry policy. Well, now we're switching gears again. My friends, let me introduce you to the Lend-Lease idea, or the Lindley Spill. Okay, so Britain was running out of money. Not hard to do while you're fighting a war. And FDR wants to help them out, but he remembers just the mess that was international debts through World War I. So he wants to avoid loaning money to Britain. So he comes up with this new idea, the idea of a Lend-Lease program. So America will lend arms or, you know, tanks or ships or whatever it needs to be to Britain. And then after the war, Britain would return it. So like if you're lending someone, I don't know, a hat, and they're supposed to return the hat once they're done with the hat. Okay, an analogy FDR uses, which is much better than the analogy I just gave you, is he, once again, another fireside chat, talking in, analogies to the common American. He says this, say your neighbor's house catches on fire. Who wouldn't lend their neighbor their garden hose? And then after the fire's put out, your neighbor will just return your garden hose. It's good for them, it's good for you. So that's the analogy he uses for this new idea, the Lend-Lease program. Okay. Of course, the isolationists are like, it's kind of like, chewing gum. That's the analogy they use. The people who do not like the Lend-Lease program saying, it's kind of like lending someone chewing gum. You wouldn't want it back. But nonetheless, this is what sticks. Congress passes the Lindley Spill, and some people do praise it. They say, send guns, not sons. We'll send billions, just not bodies. So people are like, we're okay with this. As long as our sons are safe and at home, we can make use of, sending supplies to Britain. Anyway, like I said, once again, opponents are calling it giving a blank, they call it the blank check bill, saying that, they're saying this is a thinly veiled, massive loan we're making to Britain. But nonetheless, after some debate in Congress, it does pass. And it really gives the access powers, right, the bad guys, something to think about. Because now, this Lindley Spill is more or less the United States declaring economic war on the Axis powers. Let me see. Okay, and Germany took this Lindley Spill kind of as an unofficial declaration of war by the United States. So after we pass this Lindley Spill, we see some American merchant ships starting to be attacked by German U-boats. Before this time, Germans had avoided ticking off the United States by destroying our merchant ships, but after this Lindley Spill, kind of an unofficial declaration of war, Germany's like, okay, we're going to go after you too. Example of this is a merchant ship by the name of Robin Moore was sunk May 21st, 1941. Okay, so Lend-Lease, here we go. Next section, section O, chartering a new world. Okay, so really, before Pearl Harbor, which we'll get to, which will get us actually into the war. So before Pearl Harbor, really the two events that marked the course of World War II was one, the fall of France in June of 1940, and the fall of France was probably, you could say, the end of America's neutrality. After France fell, neutrality slowly started to drift away. So that's when America really started to be involved. And the second one is what we're going to be talking about right now, is Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. Okay, so here's the deal. As we know, there was the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact that was passed in 1939. So they said, I'm not going to hurt you, you're not going to hurt me. But the problem was neither power trusted one another, okay? There was always a lot of tension there. It was kind of a marriage of convenience. So anyway, what happened is there's a lot of reasons Hitler invaded Russia, but one of them is they had been secretly meeting or secretly communicating about who would get what after World War II ended. And they had a big disagreement over the Balkans. Okay, the Balkan Peninsula is kind of like where Greece is, that peninsula. And the deal is the Balkan Peninsulas have a lot of oil. So they were kind of arguing over who would get the Balkan Peninsula. And plus, Hitler was looking at Russia, and was looking at the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had a lot of resources besides oil that was very much willing to take off the Soviet Union's hands. So what happens is, Hitler decides to crush Russia, seize oil and other resources, and, in Hitler's mind, he thought he could do this in a couple weeks, that it wasn't going to be a big deal at all. He'll go and crush Russia like he's been crushing everyone else, and he'll have his resources, and he'll be happy once again. And the democratic powers that were fighting Hitler were like so freaking happy that this is happening, right? Because the idea is they had been at war with Germany. So the idea is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if the Soviet Union wants to start fighting Hitler, we're good with that. That is fine with us. And in fact, we encourage it. So once Hitler invades the Soviet Union, America automatically starts to offer Soviet Union resources. It right off the bat gives it about $1 billion, kind of in the Lend-Lease fashion, and will actually give Russia about $11 billion throughout the course of World War II. Okay. Just to be clear, I was supposed to say $1 billion was given to the Soviet Union right off the bat. I might have said $1 million. I meant $1 billion. We gave a lot of money to Russia because we wanted Russia to kick Hitler's butt. We were very excited about that. All right, nonetheless, okay, so something else very important, of course, everything in history is important, happens in this section, and that is the Atlantic Conference. And what this is the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, secretly meets with President Roosevelt in a warship off the coast of Iceland, right? Is it Newfoundland, off the coast of Newfoundland. But the idea is they're meeting together and they're starting to talk about what they want to see happen to the world after World War II. And what they come up with is something called the Atlantic Charter. It makes sense to be called the Atlantic Charter because they make the charter while they're in a boat sitting in the Atlantic Ocean. Nonetheless, Atlantic Charter is very specific and it's very, American ideals, anti-imperialism, saying that after the war there won't be any territorial changes unless those changes are approved by the inhabitants of said country. So very much the self-determination, let the people decide what they want to do, if they want to be a part of, Russia, or if they don't, that sort of thing. And they developed something called the Atlantic Charter, like I mentioned, and the charter is, you could kind of call it the 14 points of World War II. It also wanted to set up a new sort of League of Nations. We'll actually see the UN, or the United Nations, kind of being born out of the Atlantic Charter after the war. So we already see FDR and Churchill talking about what should happen to the United States after the war. And some people are in America saying, why are you talking about how we're going to change the world after the war? FDR, you're not even declared war yet. America's not even in the war yet. So he does get some criticism back home saying, why should you have any say about what happens after the war if the United States is never going to enter the war? So people are kind of suspicious of FDR at that point. Nonetheless, Section P, U.S. destroyers and Hitler's U-boats clash. Oh no, another clash with Hitler. Who'd have thought? So here's the deal. British merchant ships needed to carry, British merchant ships were carrying U.S. goods overseas, and they were just getting pummeled by German U-boats. And it's not like the British people or Britain had enough destroyers to go around. They needed the destroyers for the war effort. So FDR decides to step up and allows or approves that U.S. battleships will escort these merchant ships, these British merchant ships, up to, I believe, Newfoundland. I just keep saying words. I hope it's Newfoundland. No, as far as Iceland. So the United States will use their battleships to escort British merchant ships as far as Iceland, and at that point, British escort will take over. All right, well, Hitler was not going to have any of this, so we do see some clashes between U.S. ships and German U-boats. We see, for example, the Reuben James is shot down. This is a U.S. ship, and 100 men die. And so Congress decides to pull the plug on the Neutrality Act of 1939. So now Congress is going to say, fine, you can, United States, arm merchant ships. We're going to be okay with that. And yes, we will allow you to enter these kind of combat zones as long as it's, you're bringing munitions to Britain. So more or less saying that now that cash and carry plan, where they had to pick up the goods, now Congress is saying, okay, never mind. U.S. ships can arm and they can bring the goods over to Britain. Okay, so just kind of these baby steps closer and closer and closer to war. So finally, this next section will actually see the United States enter the war. And this is Section Q, Surprise Assault on Pearl Harbor. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears. We're going to be talking about Japan, of course. So Japan was still being bogged down by, its invasion of China. So it's still fighting with China. And surprisingly, I think a lot of people don't realize this, the United States was still supplying Japan with fuel, with oil, with steel, with a lot of goods necessary for war. And the fear was, this was very unpopular among the American people, but the fear was that FDR thought that if we placed an embargo against Japan, that Japan was just going to hop on over and invade the British-owned East Indies and attack that and to get their oil from the British East Indies. So FDR decided, okay, if we keep supplying them, they'll just kind of stay put, they won't further expand, and it'll be fine. But eventually, this idea becomes really too unpopular, right? FDR is seeing the writing on the wall and saying, nah, we kind of have to stop supplying Japan. So we place an embargo on Japan. We freeze all Japanese assets in the United States. We stop shipping all, gasoline or other war supplies. So then finally, Japan and the State Department kind of have a negotiation session. So in November and December of 1941, Japan and the State Department start talking because Japan wants that oil embargo to be lifted. So this is the deal the State Department makes with Japan. They say, hey, Japan, if you want us to lift our embargo, we're willing to do that if you pull out of China. If you leave China alone, go back to Japan, then we'll allow the embargo to be lifted. And really, we're backing Japan a little bit into the corner because Japan had been working on its invasion of China for 4 years and kind of within pride, right? They didn't want to lose face internationally. Japan saw this as they had no choice but to go to war with the United States. If that's not super logical to you, that's okay, because it wasn't a wonderful idea for Japan to go to war with the United States. But nonetheless, this is really what sparks Japan's desire to attack the United States. And at first, we had broken their top secret code, so we actually could hear what Japan was thinking, so to speak. So we actually knew Japan was planning to go to war with the United States. However, FDR and most military advisors assumed that Japan would attack perhaps the Philippines or perhaps Malaysia, which was owned by Britain. They had no idea that Japan was strong enough or gutsy enough, really, to directly attack Hawaii. So FDR and the State Department was looking out, at the Philippines, at Malaysia, wanting to see, when Japan might strike. But it was absolutely a surprise that it happened at Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor. So, what does happen, okay? So, Japan surprisingly attacks the United States on the day which will live in infamy, December 7th of 1941. Considered to be a Black Sunday, right? Black Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Japan attacks the United States Naval Fleet at Pearl Harbor, killing 3,000 people and also destroying much of our Navy, right? Remember we had our Navy kind of on the East Coast and then we had our Navy for the West Coast. Well, this was our Navy, so to speak, for the West Coast, and it was pretty much completely destroyed by this surprise attack. So really what this does is it sparks Americans to war. So isolationists in America kind of go out the window. Any isolationist feeling is gone now because of this surprise attack. And we see December 11th, 1941, Congress officially declares war, although we've been unofficially at war for months. But we officially declare war after Pearl Harbor, December 11th. Okay. And it's, interesting to note that even at the eve, even right before, the day before Pearl Harbor attacked, most Americans still wanted to stay out of the war. So this is really awakening the great giant, which is America. All right, section R, last section of the chapter. America's transformation from bystander to belligerent. And remember, like I said before, belligerent for historical context is a nation that's at war. So this is when we kind of transform our thinking a little bit. Okay, so the American fleet was mostly destroyed or mobilized by the Pearl Harbor attack, like I said, and like I said before, this really woke up America in a way nothing else would have done. You know, this was a decisive moment. We now are totally in it to win it for the war. As one senator says, the only thing left to do was lick the hell out of them. Okay. But there, you know, the Pearl Harbor sparks the war, but we see a lot of steps America had taken kind of that was risking war. For example, when we decided to bolster Britain and we decided, to escort their merchant ships, that was very risky because we knew we'd be within range of the German U-boats. And then also in Japan, you know, when we put that ultimatum out there, when we say, hey, we're going to put the embargo on you or you're going to pull out of China, we were kind of backing them into a corner, and that was also a very risky move, and we see Pearl Harbor happen. So we had made very risky moves that would kind of induce the war. So yes, Pearl Harbor sparked it, but we were, you know, just right on the road regardless. All right. And with that, we're done.